Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Smithman. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to learn 5 different watercolor techniques. And these are techniques that you're going to use throughout your watercolor journey. So each one has a different purpose and you'll get a different effect from them. The first one is solid colors. So for solid colors, you're going to use this for anything that you want to have a nice even tone. And to do this, you're going to make sure to spread the pigment out evenly while each edge that you're connecting it to is still wet so that you don't get any lines. Because as soon as the water starts drying, you're going to get hard lines. For gradients, you're going to use this technique for things like skies or even oceans, waters. And for this, you want to make sure to either add or subtract paint as you layer it on. And you also want to make sure to continue your edges where they are still wet. Otherwise, you're going to get those hard lines. For the wet on wet technique, I use this for skies all the time, and it's very nice for blending your colors together and also getting more of an organic spread. So you're going to wet the paper first, put your pigments down, add your pigments, and just watch them bloom and combine. Here I had blue and red that mixed together and they created some purples in here. For a dry brush technique, you would use this to get more textures. You can use for fabric or grass, terrain, sand. It's good for shadows. You also get a lot more pigment on the paper than you would using a wet on wet technique or a really watered down pigment. And then lastly, we have lifting off, which you can use for creating clouds or highlights. After you've put pigment down, you take it off. So we're going to do this together. I really like keeping 2 containers of water. So I have one, which is my dirty water that I always rinse off in first, and then I go to my clean water so I don't have any cross-contamination with my colors. So I just dips into the clean water, and I like wetting the paper first for solid colors. So I wet everywhere I want the color to be, and then I go into my pigment here, and I'm just going to paint it. And I'm going to make sure all of my edges are still wet and they don't dry out. So you want to go fast, you want to keep it all wet so you get a very even color. You don't want to overwork it. I'm probably just going to leave it just like that. And just a side note, as you're doing this, you want to always make sure that you're never leaving behind pools of water. If you have pools of water, your pigment's going to sit and be drawn towards the water, and you're going to get hard lines once it dries. So the next one's going to be gradient, and some artists like building up their colors, going from light and then adding more and more pigment until you get the darkest part of it. But I like going from dark to light. And how I do this is I wet the paper first using a wet on wet technique. And then I get the pigment and I saturate it really well. And then we begin by just adding the pigment down. Your darkest pigment goes up top here. And then as you get towards the bottom, you start lifting off the paper with your brush and you get lighter and lighter. And then what you can do is pull this down while it's still wet, of course. And then you get this nice gradient. If you need to, you can add more pigment to the top as long as the paper is still wet. And you just keep pulling it down, lifting off the paper as you go. You want to make sure your brush is touching the paper less and less. And then we're just going to let that sit and dry. Rinse my brush off here in the dirty water and then go to the clean water, because now we're going to go for a wet on wet technique. We want clean water for this. So for wet on wet, it's exactly what it sounds like. We're going to wet the paper first, everywhere we want our pigment to go. And then you're going to pick up your pigment. So I really like doing multiple pigments for wet on wet. I like using this for clouds and skies, and you're just going to do random patterns. I'm not really making anything right here. I'm just showing you how the wet on wet works. So you see how the color blooms? And that's because it's going wherever you've put water. So now I'm going to pick up another pigment. So red works really nicely with blue because you can get purples. And then you're just going to put it on the paper while it's still wet. And you can mix it up in areas. You can draw through it. And you see how it's making this lovely purple color, but it's still leaving some of the original pigments like the blues and the reds. And you can move it around and make edits up until it dries, because as soon as it dries, you're going to get hard edges if you make any changes. So this should dry nicely. For the next technique, we're going to do dry brush. So for this, you're going to wash all the pigment off your brush, and then you're going to dry your brush off very well. It doesn't have to be extra dry, it just needs to be dry enough to add texture to your paper. So you're going to dry your brush off, and then you're going to pick up your pigment, and then you're going to just brush it across the page. You can use as much or as little pressure as you want. Right now I'm using very little pressure. And you get this nice textured effect that almost looks like color pencil or crayon. And you can use this for fabrics or landscapes, terrain, sand, grass. So that was very lightly, and now this is very dark. So this, I'm just going over the area. I'm pressing harder on my brush. And then lastly, we have the lifting off technique. This is very useful for skies, when you're doing clouds. So you're gonna wet your paper, and then you're gonna go in with your pigment. Color the whole area. And then, before it dries, you're going to go in with a paper towel or your brush or a rag, and you're going to crumple up your rag, and you're just going to press down pretty hard, and you're just going to leave it there for a second or two. You see how the color is lifted off there? And then also what you can do is you can drag your brush through, but you don't want to do this too hard because then you're going to start ripping your paper. So for this, you're just going to lightly drag through, and this is how you create light streaks. You can also drag through with your brush. You're just going to lift the pigments off, and you're going to dry your brush in between. And you can do that until the area dries. Now I can't do any more edits because it is mostly dry. It's still a little damp, but it's dry enough. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Please like and subscribe. I'll be doing a whole bunch more beginner series videos to show you things like composition and color theory and other watercolor techniques. Thank you.